Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Taking Back Birth with myself, your host, Kristen Nagle. And today I'm so honored to have on here with me Lily Nichols. She is the author of, I actually forget the first, I know it's gestational diabetes, but I always talk about your real food for pregnancy.
It's real food for gestational diabetes. So very
perfect. There it is. Simple. So it's an excellent resource. Anytime anyone comes with me with questions about nutrition, around pregnancy, preconception, or anything around there, like this is the resource that I always tell people that is a must in their collection. So thank you very much for joining today. I was mentioning I'm in my living room capsule. This guy was supposed to be busy, but we'll see how today goes, but I think it's going to be fine. We're just diving right into mom life, which is part of the nutrition world, right? How do you get the proper nutrition when you have multiple beings around and you're worrying about feeding them and trying to feed yourself? I think it's a big question. I think a lot of moms struggle with.
Real.
Yes.
I'm in the thick of it too, a little further along than you, but I have a 3 and a 7-year-old, so I get it.
Yes. My oldest, it just turned 8. So same thing. Oh, no, I guess he's joining the show.
Yes.
So I would like to just start off with asking, like, how did you get into your first book on gestational diabetes?
Yeah. So, my work really has centered around prenatal care and gestational diabetes care for over a decade. And when I was working clinically, I had just come from starting work with the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, where we focus on educational resources and training for other professionals and improving guidelines surrounding treatment, diagnosis of gestational diabetes. And it was in my clinical role that I was like utilizing these same guidelines and was like, oh my, like it seems like we could be doing a lot more to improve outcomes than we were doing, right? I wasn't getting the results that I had hoped. And so that's really what led me down a very long research journey and trying to uncover what would be a better approach for managing gestational diabetes. And in doing so, that revealed quite a few areas of the guidelines that were, due for improvement, that we could update to significantly improved outcomes. And indeed we did. We had about a 50% reduction in the percentage of our clients who needed medication or insulin for blood sugar management. There was significant improvement in our obstetric outcomes and birth outcomes. So fewer babies were born larger size than average, which is a typical consequence of gestational diabetes when it's not well managed. Lower rates of other pregnancy complications like preeclampsia, lower rates of neonatal hypoglycemia. All of this was the result of, the nutrition things that we had implemented. And so I had to write Real Food for Gestational Diabetes because I felt like the resources that are currently available, this is back in 2015, so it's been around for a while now, but still at the time, and I would say this persists currently, the other resources available really are not teaching a nutrition approach that actually improves outcomes. A lot of time it's like the intervention is a mismatch for the diagnosis. It's just way too high in carbohydrates for somebody with carbohydrate intolerance. It's one of the ways of defining gestational diabetes. It's too many for their body to handle, leading them to have high blood sugar, leading to all these medical interventions and all of these other complications. When you focus on, whole foods, slightly reduce the carbs to a person's carbohydrate tolerance, like suddenly outcomes improve dramatically. It's really not rocket science, but it did take quite a bit of work and quite a lot of research for people to trust that actually is the case. So yeah, that was the first book. It felt like it had to be written because I was just so tired of seeing poor outcomes as a result of people. Really, they're trying to do their due diligence and follow the guidelines, but the guidelines are outdated. So
to be honest, the guidelines are terrible. And I'm really grateful for the work that you've done as, a registered dietitian, because I had mentioned before we got recording that I was a former NICU nurse. I spent 14 years working in that industry, and I was always shocked at the lack of nutritional support given to mothers. and how to improve, gestational diabetes, how to avoid it, how to, and all the things that we could have avoided coming into the unit with larger babies, with, insulin issues, sugar issues, then needing IV support or other interventions. And it's, like you said, it's really simple. It's not rocket science, but it's amazing how much research, you needed to do to show this, and that it's still not happening really at all.
Yeah. It's so complicated, and gestational diabetes really does, it presents on a spectrum, right? You have some really mild cases that really, simple nutrition interventions fix. And then you have more severe cases. Like sometimes you're really getting women who had like pretty advanced prediabetes or full-blown type 2 diabetes, and they didn't know. And it's because we're not doing a great job of screening the average population for blood sugar goals, glycemic parameters, that they don't get diagnosed until pregnancy. So quite a few of them are just like, this is an ongoing metabolic challenge for this woman, and we're just identifying it in pregnancy. But it can present on a wide range. You have some where simple nutrition interventions are like all that's needed. Other people need to be really, really diligent. Some people, despite being super diligent, they still need, medication and insulin, but that can actually be super well managed, and they can still have a very low risk pregnancy, super healthy outcome, despite that, right? But there's a varying degree of like intervention that's needed depending on the case. And I think our medical system kind of just like puts it all into one category. It's like, oh, gestational diabetes, you're automatically high risk. And because the dietary intervention we give is so poor, you end up with way more women on insulin and medication than need to be, despite that being an important tool for a subset of women who get diagnosed, right? I'm not anti-medication or insulin. Like they are certainly needed in certain situations, but with sort of like this hamster wheel of putting way too many women on it who otherwise could manage their blood sugar much better if they were just given proper advice.
Absolutely. And I remember a few women coming into the unit afterwards, and talking about managing, and I want to almost say that in quotation marks, because what they thought was managing was causing, severe troubles for themselves and their pregnancy. They just thought, okay, my, blood sugar is increased, take my insulin, bring it back down, and then it's okay. Like, I know I'm going to go out and eat, this heavy carb meal, but then I'll have my insulin, bring it down. So constantly with very huge spikes that could be, just managed. And then, but the lack of education around the harm that those huge jumps cause.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think, it's shocking that it's not, but your book should be like a prerequisite, like for everyone. You're probably thinking, yes, I've been trying.
Well, I mean, there is hope. The Czech Republic actually changed their national guidelines on nutrition for gestational diabetes following the research that's in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes as of 2016. My book just happened to like get in the right hands of a perinatologist, diabetes specialist who was able to elicit change. Probably just a smaller country, it's easier to do so. I don't know. There's so much red tape in the US. But they have since reported significant reductions, similar to what I saw in clinic, reduction in medication and insulin requirements, improved birth outcomes, less macrosomia, less NICU stays, all the things, which, ultimately saves the whole healthcare system a whole lot of money and resources. I mean, even back when I was working with the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, every dollar spent in our program saved the state $5, because if you have better controlled blood sugar in pregnancy, like the environment that baby is growing in utero is different, and it actually affects the development of their pancreas and their metabolism and their insulin and glucose regulation system. So like when you have blood sugar poorly controlled for the entirety of the pregnancy, the chances that child will go on to develop type 2 diabetes is anywhere from 6 to 19-fold higher than a woman who has normal blood sugar levels.
Yeah, that's huge.
So when we're seeing all this childhood diabetes, it's not just that the kids are eating poorly and they're inactive and too much screen time, and those are contributing factors, of course. But these kids, like genetics or epigenetics, they've been pre-programmed to have more challenges with blood sugar and insulin regulation, more challenges with like just burning fuels appropriately, because they've literally been bathed in this in utero environment that's high sugar, and their little bodies, the baby in utero, is putting out lots and lots and lots of insulin to try to overcome that. So they're born insulin resistant. Like it's like the odds are not in their favor when that occurs. So it's a two birds with one stone situation. You know, you help the mom have better nutrition, you help the baby develop better. Their metabolic health can be better lifelong. So it does save significant healthcare money and resources if we can get this information out there.
I find that so fascinating. There's so much opportunity to save healthcare costs.
Yeah.
I know in the States, I worked in Arizona for a year, my first year at a nursing school. So I saw how things were done there. In Canada, we have the socialized care where, our taxpayers pay for everything and it's considered free, which, yes, it comes from somewhere. But it's interesting, right? Because there's all this data of how we can save money and how we can save resources and interventions. And yet there's so much pushback to do so. It must be, I felt frustrated as a nurse in this area, trying to do that and educate. And we're just very much tertiary reactive care versus there's no prevention side of anything. And you must have found this very frustrating in your area. And I'm curious if you had any pushbacks from colleagues. Like, what do you sense why this is not just readily taken and used? And
right. Well, I have to say, even not too long after I was doing all this, what I thought was really important work, state of California hitting a budget crisis, like significantly defunded that program. So despite having clear data that it's, helping improve outcomes and ultimately save the state money, it's still somewhat in operation, but at significantly lower level than it once was. So, that's like its own like political stuff. I think when it comes to practitioners, I think pregnancy in particular is, a lot of people just don't want to touch pregnancy with like a 10-foot pole. It feels too risky to do anything that's different from the guidelines. And I think it actually took me like working clinically one-on-one with patients and, seeing people's blood sugar logs, like seeing the guidelines not work. I mean, it's right in your face and it's very obvious. I mean, all the other research on low carb for diabetes, outside of pregnancy is all like very positive. I mean, it is like one of the most logical interventions for improving outcomes. When you talk about the harms of those big blood sugar spikes, and there's substantial research on that, both outside of pregnancy, but especially during pregnancy, the best way to reduce those spikes is to reduce the carbohydrate levels in the diet and increase their intake of their other nutrients, protein and fat. Really stabilizes the blood sugar and evens out that crazy roller coaster, thus vastly improving outcomes. But because the guidelines have, specific set points for the level of carbohydrates and some, links back to what we now know is outdated research saying that going lower carb than that is overtly harmful. People don't want to go there. It is too scary. And that's why in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, the whole last chapter is like all the picking apart the research on how those guidelines were formed, evidence that their suggested harms from going lower carb actually do not bear out in the research. And actually, since the book has been published, more research has come out in support of that, in support of what I'm putting forward in that book. But again, people are very it's too scary to do anything other than like, this is what the guidelines are. And I think practitioners feel especially, risk averse or have like they might have some liability if something goes wrong. So thus we just fall back onto whatever the official statement is.
Mm-hmm.
It's like frustrating because the evidence used to set those official guidelines, and this is not just in this area. I mean, the whole dietary guidelines are a hot mess, right?
Yes.
You go back and you look at the evidence that's used to set these things, and it is embarrassing, like the lack of data and the assumptions that were made, like, oh, well, because of this, like, then we'll make this leap. This must be true. And it's not the case. You know, I'm just talking about gestational diabetes and carbohydrate levels, but like, you know, the study came out recently analyzing the micronutrient requirements for pregnancy in the guideline, the evidence used to set those RDA and adequate intake levels and whatnot. And they looked at all 23 micronutrients, and only less than 5% of the study populations for all of these 704 studies used to set those guidelines included a single pregnant or lactating participant. And these are the RDAs for, you know, pregnancy and lactation. And most of them are set without any data whatsoever on pregnancy. I mean, it's absolutely wild. But it takes so much in order to change those guidelines that are based on barely any evidence. It feels like this insurmountable hurdle where we simply don't even have the studies available to give us the data we need to change them. You know what I mean? So like, what do we do? Are we going to sit around like this for like 50 years waiting for people to fund the studies that make nobody money? I mean, like, studies only get funded if somebody is going to benefit from it.
Yes.
And if the benefit is going to small farmers and not pharma, like, you know, where's the incentive? So it's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. What you said is, you know, is no one wants to touch pregnancy, right? They don't want to mess with that. You know, you hear, you know, it's unethical to test on pregnant women. And, and all I'm thinking when I hear that is, but they have no problem continuing to mandate more injections that has no research on what that does to mom, the fetus, baby, like, you know, longer outcomes. I saw a lot of things happening in the NICU, and I wondered, it would be a very simple task to look back if this was like a question asked, like what shots, because I know when I was pregnant, especially with my first two, I didn't know as much as I did now, especially with my first one, but the things that they try to push on that time. It's like, you know, you can't eat this, you can't do that, but you definitely need to get, you know, whooping cough or DTaP or whatever it is, like now that they're pushing. And I find that just so fascinating that unwilling to look at food, but here is all this synthetic, you know, chemicals, poison and other things.
I think it just comes down to the same things. You have a lot of clinicians who just want to trust whatever the guidelines are and don't look into it. I mean, you've been a busy clinician yourself, right? When you're actively working and you're totally exhausted, burnt out working the NICU. Also, there's like hospital policy you have to like follow in order to keep your job. I mean, it's a similar thing where you like the people who have the time to look into these things are not the ones who are actively treating patients, because our healthcare system doesn't allow enough time for clinicians to learn these things. You know, if it's not part of our training and you don't spend the time on your own time off work to, you know, actively question the guidelines, the easy way out is to just do what you're told.
Just to follow along. So,
I think there's some parallels there for sure.
That was when my eyes were opened. It was around when my first son was born, because I just realized the importance of food. Something came over me and I was like, I need to look into this. And I ended up going back to school to become a holistic nutritionist. And I think that's when I first kind of heard of your work, because I was like, kind of what you had mentioned earlier, you know, it's not rocket science. I was like, oh my gosh, like health is so simple. Like why was we didn't learn any of this in nursing school? Why weren't we practicing this? And then I kind of realized it's because, well, they almost don't want you to know. And like you said, you have to do your own research and step outside of the clinical role and do this all in your own time. And then that's where you find, you know, this information and you see the results, right? Like there's so much to like the field work of actually seeing the anecdotal work, right? That we don't seem to accept for whatever reason. But there's so much proof in that. And like you have seen over the years of, you know, actually now helping women, helping mothers and babies, and seeing those results like that's the facts right there. And I know I don't have you. I'm like, oh, there's so much I want to talk to you about, and I don't have you for a long time. But at the very beginning, you mentioned, you know, just gestational diabetes and all the things it relates to. And one of the things was preeclampsia. And I really want to talk about that as well, because that's been coming up a lot in my world with people. Just either they have it, you know, and it leads to help, or it leads to, you know, pre-planned C-sections and all the risks around that right now. And what I have learned this last year is that it actually is, I was like, I know, because you can't say treat. It can actually be, you know, helped with diet. And again, that's another thing, you know, a lot of clinicians and OBs to say, no, like food will not help this. And we know that that is not true. So I was wondering if that's something you can talk about, like what you have seen in your field of work, you know, things to recommend, or what can people do with preeclampsia?
Yeah.
Or what causes it even, like the kind of...
I wish we had all the answers to all that, because there are a lot of big questions that remain with preeclampsia. So, you know, preeclampsia is like a gestational hypertensive disorder. It involves like dysfunction of your blood vessels. Some instances, very severe, can lead to organ failure. But it's a little more than just high blood pressure, because they're also looking for, you know, evidence of protein in your urine. Sometimes there's some other factors that they'll look for as well. But what's tricky about it is we don't know precisely what causes it. And not all, again, sort of like gestational diabetes, it presents in like a wide array of severity. And so some cases are really mild and nutrition interventions work really wonderfully to help it. And then other cases are, you know, much more severe, and you need some more, you know, medical intervention to get blood pressure and symptomology like under control. The other tricky thing is, although preeclampsia usually presents later in pregnancy, there is a fair amount of data suggesting that its development starts earlier. Like there's hallmark signs of preeclampsia earlier on. Like it has something to do with, you know, the development of the placenta not going precisely as it should. And that all starts from, arguably, it starts from preconception with egg and sperm quality. But the development of the placenta is really primarily happening in the first trimester. So, you know, if you don't have proper, you know, the placenta kind of has to like invade the endometrial wall. So you have like sufficient vasculature to like transfer blood, you know, which of course moves like nutrients and waste products to and from baby. If that doesn't go super well, like you can end up with issues that show up later in the pregnancy. And so like, can we prevent it if this started earlier on? Like, well, yes and no. It depends on when we're talking about intervening. That said, there are also, you know, other comorbidities, like other complications, I guess I should say, in pregnancy that can predispose women to preeclampsia, gestational diabetes being one of them. You know, poorly controlled blood sugar often coincides with or leads to high blood pressure as well. Like the two go hand in hand. And I would see this in practice. We'd improve blood sugar levels, and the woman who was like borderline preeclamptic, suddenly her blood pressure normalizes. She stops spilling protein in her urine. It was like, whoa, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But also when you take dietary history on women with preeclampsia, even if they are women, you know, again, in the same practice as me, like they passed their glucose tolerance test or whatever screening for gestational diabetes, so they weren't seeing me for that, but then they later developed preeclampsia. You take a dietary history on them, and again, I'm not saying this is true for all women, but the majority of the cases I saw, despite them passing their glucose tolerance test, their diet was like primarily refined carbs and processed foods. You know, so although they passed the screening test, they probably still had high blood sugar, and or just the diet quality was not up to par. And when you go back to some of the earliest work on preeclampsia, like the Brewer's diet is, you know, a fairly popular intervention. There's actually quite a bit of modern data that I say supports at least some of what his interventions were, specifically more protein and more electrolytes, especially potassium, magnesium, and salt, sodium too. You increase the levels of primarily all three of those, displace the processed foods and sugars, and almost without fail, you're going to see improvement in blood pressure levels. Is it going to be enough that you've like totally reversed preeclampsia or like all your blood pressure readings are normal? Depends on the case, of course. But there usually is pretty significant improvement at the very least. If you can bring those numbers down a little bit, you're significantly reducing the chances of adverse outcomes related to preeclampsia. But yeah, big ones are, that protein, the electrolytes, including sufficient salt in the diet, and just whole real foods displacing the processed stuff. Like that's really the primary thing that tends to bring things into balance. Whether it can be fully prevented, I think we just have to rewind the clock like so far back.
Yeah. That's really hard to know.
It's hard to say.
And
interestingly, like up to, I think it's something like up to 13% of preeclampsia cases can be blamed almost entirely on paternal factors.
Interesting.
Paternal. So since the placenta is formed from the products of conception, you have both mom and dad's DNA in there, and the placenta really highly expresses the paternal genome. So like if dad is pretty unhealthy, there's a possibility that that can predispose to preeclampsia. Like there's quite a bit of research that's shocking on the whole male factor part of preeclampsia. Like you can take a man who, say a woman has had like 2 healthy pregnancies, no preeclampsia, and then she has a 3rd baby with another guy, and he has a history of his previous kids with other women. They had preeclampsia. She'll probably have preeclampsia in that pregnancy. So there's like weird things that we don't fully understand that could go all the way back to genetics that can play a role in the development as well. But I do believe certainly that lifestyle factors can often help, at the very least, reduce severity or delay the onset of preeclampsia, or make treatment a little bit easier, even if it's not like a magic bullet for every single case.
Mm-hmm. And isn't that so fascinating? Like to think of the parental or paternal is what I meant to say. Thank you. Just because a lot of times it feels like it falls a lot on the woman for nutrition, for even preconception, during pregnancy and everything, and postpartum. But it is fascinating, that it takes both parents. And it takes both parents being involved and taking responsibility for their health and nutrition or things they're doing as they plan to create a baby together. And so I think that's a really interesting point for men to realize the importance of their role in this too. Sure. They don't get off scot-free in all of it. And then one of the things, is salt, right? I feel like that comes up a lot, like, watch your salt intake, don't eat too much salt. And I feel a lot of women are probably salt deficient or not taking enough sodium. And you must see that a lot, because I feel like that is something we've been told to avoid, but in fact, we actually need more. As our blood volume increases significantly by, I believe, 60%. And it has to be, like real salt. I don't know if you have, I'm trying to remember from your book if there's, specific salts you recommend, but it is very important in diet.
There's other trace minerals and things that would be in unrefined salt for sure that can be helpful, and you're not going to have the weird fillers and flow agents and other things that they put in super refined salt. But absolutely, like salt itself, you do need more of in pregnancy. As blood volume goes up, you need electrolytes to go with it. If you go to the hospital and you're dehydrated, they don't give you an IV of distilled water. They give you an IV. At the very least, it's saline solution. Sometimes there's other things in it. You would know as a nurse, right? Because you anytime you're giving fluids, you need electrolytes as well. So it's funny that we're so anti-salt, but anyways, with pregnancy specifically, the salt needs do increase, and with preeclampsia, even though most of the guidelines in particular, but a lot of the research scientists are trying to argue for low salt intake, you don't see it panning out as improving, either preventing or treating preeclampsia. And in fact, oftentimes when you give more salt, the severity of preeclampsia decreases. You're normalizing, the fluid volume, electrolyte balance, hydration, and whatnot. So they've actually found that if you give a low salt diet or too low of a salt diet in pregnancy, it actually can lead to volume depletion. So, making you more dehydrated. Your body has all sorts of hormonal compensatory mechanisms to offset. Like if salt intake is too low, you're just going to pee out extra fluids so you can keep your sodium concentration to the level it needs to be for baby's development, for your heart to keep beating, for your brain to keep working, right? So if you're not getting the salt in, your body's going to be trying to pee out, the extra fluids. And they have found that when the diet is too low in salt, you can have intrauterine growth restriction, low birth weight, organ underdevelopment, and it may even affect the baby's lifelong, vascular or kidney health. So I think it's really important that we kind of shift the conversation around it. It gets complicated because typically, when you're thinking about high sodium intake, it's often correlated with people eating lots of processed foods. And our processed foods do have a ton of salt. It's not balanced with other minerals. They're low in potassium, they're low in magnesium. So you're not getting the right ratio of your electrolytes, which is problematic. But also those processed foods are often really high in sugar or refined carbohydrates. So you have this, crackers or chips or something, and it's, refined carbohydrates with a whole bunch of refined salt in it. You're not getting the balance of minerals. But if you have somebody switch to a whole foods diet and suddenly their salt intake goes way down because it's only food they're cooking at home, my opinion is a lot of people at home do not cook with enough salt, especially if they're new to it and they've been relying on pre-seasoned things or processed dipping sauces and dressings and marinades and flavor packets, and now they're cooking with herbs and spices instead. You can't leave out the salt, so it's kind of the conversation is a little more nuanced than just eat more salt, because if you're eating more salt from processed foods, you're not going to help anything. We're talking about using sea salt or unrefined salt paired with a diet that's mostly unprocessed foods. And that is just a whole different animal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the other thing in there, the other thing in there is protein. I know that I feel a lot of women, and recently I've been kind of seeing this in the area because I'm moving into birth work now that I've left the NICU. Birth work is kind of, my passion right now. And there's a lot of, and I don't know if you're seeing this in your practice, but a huge shift into the vegan diet. And so I know a lot of practitioners are seeing troubles with the lack of protein or proper protein, or what that looks like. Because I know even, you look right on, the front page of your book, you got, beautiful cheese, you got your salmon for the omega-3s for healthy fats, and there is red meat, and there's, beef on the bottom. Yeah. And that goes, I think, with, again, real food, whole foods, in an all-encompassing diet. And I don't know in your work if you've seen issues related to this and, the lack of protein, or if there's been a shift in the last few years you've seen with eating less, and what that might look like.
Yeah, it totally depends on the population. I think we're seeing it shift a little bit back now away from veganism, but definitely the past couple of years seemed pretty heavy on it. It's both. You have the everybody loves their dietary extremes, right? So you have one camp that's going plant-based, vegan, either under the guise of health or saving the planet. And then on the other side, you have people going full on carnivore and all plants are evil. And so, everybody loves their extremes. I will say, the protein component is really vital for preeclampsia, both prevention and treatment. And not just the quantity of protein, which, like, to speak back to the fact that our guidelines are outdated, the data used to set the protein guidelines on pregnancy is really poor. Our first ever study looking at protein requirements in pregnant women was done in 2015. Okay. And they found the requirements in late pregnancy are 73% higher than the guidelines say they are. Okay. So we all need we need a whole 180 on the protein conversation, arguably population-wide, because the RDA is woefully inadequate for the entire population. But for pregnancy, since that's what we're talking about today, also woefully inadequate. So we need to aim higher for protein for everybody across the board in pregnancy. But beyond just higher, numerical, this many grams of protein, you need to think about protein quality. And there's a big expanding area of research looking at different amino acids and their role in health. And some of these amino acids were previously considered what's called non-essential, which is you don't have to get it from your diet. Your body can make it from other amino acids. And some of those, two of them actually in particular, glycine and taurine, there's some pretty strong research that those can play a role in prevention and or treatment of preeclampsia. And glycine you can get in both plant and animal foods, but plant foods have very low concentrations of it. And taurine is completely absent from plant foods. You only get it from animal foods, mainly red meat, seafood being some of the best sources. So these amino acids play important roles, glycine in particular, in the elasticity of your blood vessels. They reduce oxidative stress, so combat, inflammation, essentially. They help with lowering blood sugar. Taurine acts as some research calls it a wonder molecule. It's kind of like an antioxidant, but it does so many things. It's hard to even sum it up in one sentence. But taurine seems to be really vital for the blood pressure component and offsetting inflammation. And one of the hallmarks of preeclampsia is inflammation and oxidative stress. So anything that's helping to sort of bring that fire down a little bit tends to be helpful. So absolutely, I think we need more focus on protein, and that doesn't even get into the, micronutrient conversation, which if you want to have a healthy pregnancy, you really need to be eating the most nutrient dense foods possible, the things that have the highest concentrations of vitamins and minerals. And without fail, I think the one exception might be leafy greens. You look at the most nutrient dense foods on the planet, and they're all protein rich animal foods. I mean, really. And this isn't just me saying it. There's actually research that's looking at these key markers of key micronutrients and the top food sources of each. And they're the ones who made that determination. It's not just me. I mean, I could say that too, but again, it's not one person's opinion. The top nutrient dense foods are of animal origin, and then just by default, they also happen to be high in protein, as most animal foods are. So my opinion is that we need a balance of both. There is a conversation in chapter 3 of Real Food for Pregnancy on nutrients of concern on a vegetarian diet, because of course there's going to be people who want to eat that way. And so there's, specific recommendations on foods to emphasize, supplements, things like that to try to offset, any potential deficiencies.
That I know I don't have you for much longer, I believe. How are we kind of at the end, or do you have a little bit more?
I think we could do about 5 minutes more, and then I've got a hard stop.
Got it. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. Just interesting, mentioning the supplements, and I'm not going to dive too much into this, but in Canada, our, government is just all against anything, that keep you healthy. So they're actually looking at banning all natural supplements, all supplements, vitamins, and everything. So that made me really think about, certain diets where, you can't get certain, nutrients from the food you're eating, and you rely on these supplements. And anyways, I'm just thinking out loud that that's going to be a very interesting shift of what that might happen to a lot of diets and outcomes moving forward.
I can't imagine they're going to get that passed through. We'll see. But yeah, I mean, somebody who's vegan, for example, like they other than vegan foods fortified with vitamin B12, there's no sources of vitamin B12 in their diet, right? So a supplement is a necessity. There's no sources of preformed retinol, vitamin A in their diet. So a supplement is a necessity. There's no sources of DHA in their diet. So algae-based DHA supplement is the only option. Your body can only convert a very, very, very small percentage of the plant omega-3s into that form. So yeah, I don't know how that's going to pan out, but it doesn't sound wise.
No,
at all.
No, it's going to cause, a lot of troubles. And I never even thought about until now talking about it, this certain diets that this is really going to affect in future outcomes in pregnancy and beyond. So I have you for just a very brief couple minutes left. We, mentioned, as my baby sleeping beside me, she fell asleep at the end, but she's been good. Postpartum, I think a lot we take for granted in the healing aspects of what that looks like afterwards. And, I don't know, briefly in a couple minutes, just, emphasize the importance of food or what to look at. And I was like, this is a big topic to end with, so I don't know how you want to wrap this all up. I'm just going to, tell people to go get your book for
more than a 2-minute topic.
Yes.
I just a couple resources. I do have a blog post called Real Food Postpartum Recovery Meals that people can check out if they don't have my book. But the last chapter is all about postpartum, 4th trimester. I started writing Real Food for Pregnancy when my son was about 10 months old. So I was still arguably in the thick of it, out of maybe the postpartum fog or whatever you want to call it, but certainly in the thick of recovery. So the main points to keep in mind with postpartum, we don't need to overcomplicate things. The same foods and nutrients that were helpful for you during pregnancy when you're growing a baby are still helpful for you postpartum in your recovery, particularly also if you're breastfeeding, because the baby's outside of your body, but it's still growing from your body because you are growing and making the food for your baby, right? So, I mean, there's a reciprocal relationship there between the two. So there's a lot of micronutrients that can be really helpful for your recovery, for your mental health, for your energy, for coping with the perpetual sleep disruption that happens when you have babies and young children. Just the building blocks of tissue, when you think about like your uterus recovering and it shrinks down and like completely remodels, that takes a lot of protein, especially collagen-rich proteins. You might have a surgical wound or a tear, something that needs nutrients to recover. Again, protein, collagen being really important for that, but like vitamins A, C, zinc, glycine, B vitamins, a lot of these things are really helpful for tissues to repair. You have the transition from pregnancy to breastfeeding, whether a woman chooses to do that for long or not. The hormonal shift takes place regardless. That takes a lot of nutrients. Your thyroid has to pretty much completely remodel after pregnancy as well. That takes a lot of nutrients to help that run optimally. So especially your like vitamin D, iron, zinc, iodine, selenium, B vitamins. There's a long list of nutrients. But the take-home message really is that if you focus on the same foods that you did during pregnancy and continue that on postpartum, you're going to have a much smoother, healthier recovery. And do keep in mind that your nutrient requirements postpartum are actually higher than they were during pregnancy, which is not the message we're giving moms. The wide message via media, family, whoever, is like, you kind of done your work. Oh, you grew your baby and now like everything goes back to normal. and, get your pre-baby body back or whatever, nonsense is thrown around, your nutrient demands are significantly higher. Even the RDA levels, okay? It's not just me. Even the RDA levels, although they should be higher than they are, even those are higher for a lot of different nutrients. So we know it takes more calories, more protein, more vitamins and minerals for you to recover and also to produce breast milk. So do not undereat, particularly on the protein. Again, we now have data. They looked at women 3 to 6 months postpartum and looked at their protein requirements. And they're at the level or higher than what a typical female athlete needs. Okay, that's at 3 to 6 months postpartum. After the big major healing part, like that first month, first 6 weeks is very heavy on the healing, right? Healing from birth and recovering from birth is a big job. Even at 3 to 6 months postpartum, protein needs higher than an athlete. So by all means, we already talked about protein, continue prioritizing it and eat much larger portions of protein postpartum. It's so hard to eat well postpartum unless you have other people preparing food for you or heating up food for you or whatever, because taking care of a newborn is absolutely a full-time round-the-clock job. So elicit help from friends, family, community, whoever. But you'll find if you're under eating protein, you are going to be absolutely ravenous. And the quickest to grab foods are almost always pantry items, which are mostly carbs. And then they leave you feeling like garbage on a blood sugar roller coaster. Your mental health suffers. You'll feel anxious when your blood sugar crashes. It's not sustainable. So really prioritize the protein, and your physical and mental health will absolutely thank you. And that blog I recommended, Real Food Postpartum Recovery Meals, I link out to 50 plus recipes. I don't expect new moms to be up and cooking on their own. Those are to share with your family members or pre-prep in your freezer or give to your community who's doing a meal train for you, or to inspire things that you could order for takeout or meal delivery, whatever it is. Again, I don't want moms to be juggling a newborn and trying to cook recipes or whatever, but you do need nourishment. And it's absolutely night and day how you feel when you're well-fed postpartum versus not.
It's a good reminder for me. So I'm sitting here, haven't had my breakfast yet. So, all right.
Guilty
I hear
you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know there's so much. This is a big topic that we could dive into so many areas. So I just recommend, if anybody has any further questions, please get one of Lily's books, either, Real Food for Pregnancy, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Check out her website. I think it's yourname.com.
Yeah, it's Lily Nichols RDN.com.
Okay, rdn.com. You find her there. I think that's also where you can find her books to purchase. And really, it's in the title. It's just really look at the pictures. It's real food. I always say food touched by the sun, or food that God recognizes, whatever however you want to see it. And just a wide variety of, eating the rainbow as well.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that my kids kind of worked out for this. So hopefully we'll be in touch again and have further conversations down the road.
Thanks so much, Kristen.
You're welcome. All right. And those joining in, you'll see this in the next day. I'll be airing this Wednesday at 7 p.m. Also, what I wanted to say is check out our birth conference that we're having in London, Ontario, September 23rd. We're going to have amazing speakers coming in talking about all things, nutrition, pregnancy, physiological birth. It's going to be amazing. So that is Reclaiming Birth, September 23rd in London, Ontario. So we'll see you then. All right, everyone. Thank you.